I am Requisitions Officer Tertius Grade Malcon Vare, Imperial Navy, assigned to Penal Transport Vessel Unrepentant Laborer. I record this testimony into the ship's secondary cogitator array because the primary system no longer accepts my command codes. The date, as far as I can determine, is 847. M41. Though I have reason to doubt this, I will begin with what I remember of clean air. Before my commission, I lived on Cyprus Secundus, a world where you could breathe without tasting recycled sweat. My father operated a moisture farm on the eastern plateaus. The air there moved, actual wind, not ventilation, and carried the smell of iron-rich soil after rain. I remember standing at 14 years old, watching dropships descend through clouds that formed naturally, not from atmospheric processes. The ships came for the tithe. 300 young men that year. I was the first to volunteer because I believed service meant honor. The Schola Progenium taught me different words for the same thing: duty, function, expendability. I learned them all. I was 23 when they assigned me to unrepentant laborer. The ship stretched 9 kilometers from prow to stern, designed as a mobile detention facility with warp capability. Our manifest capacity rated at 80,000 souls, though the administrative preferred the term units. We transported criminals, real and administrative, to penal worlds across the segmentum solar. The ship's hull was 300 years old. I could feel it in the deck plating, how certain sections vibrated at frequencies that suggested metal fatigue the tech priests chose not to address. My quarters measured 4 meters by 3, which the Navy considered generous for my rank. I had a desk, a bunk, a basin. I had a small mirror I'd purchased on Cypra, real glass, which I kept polished. I looked at my face each morning and recognized it. The convicts arrived in processing groups of 5,000. They came shackled in mag restraints, shuffling in lines that took 6 hours to fully embark. I stood in Processing Bay Gamma, 7 with my data slate, logging each prisoner by designation number, origin world, and sentence duration. Their crimes varied: heresy, murder, theft of imperial resources, failure to meet production quotas, seditious language, unlicensed reproduction. The Imperium criminalizes with thorough efficiency. A man from Mortwald stood before me, prisoner 44,721, sentenced to 20 years labor for speaking a joke about a local cardinal. He was 60 years old. The math was simple. He would die in the mines. I logged his data and gestured him forward. The line continued. The crew complement numbered 2,400. Captain Heros Kalin commanded, a veteran of 40 years Imperial Navy service with a face that looked carved from shipstone. His first officer was Commander Yanacelis, who had survived 3 warp incursions and carried burn scars across half his neck from an engine room incident he never discussed. The ship's complement included 3 navigators housed in their sealed sanctum, 12 tech priests who maintained the vessel's machine spirits through endless ritual, 800 armsmen for security, 400 general crew for operations, and 1,000 support personnel like myself who processed the endless data the Imperium required. We were not a warship. We were a cargo hauler that happened to carry cargo that could scream. I had served aboard Unrepentant Laborer for 7 years when we departed Calth Station with a full manifest. 80,000 prisoners in the containment decks. 2,400 crew. Destination Penal World Gorast Ajax. 16 days warp transit. Routine delivery. I had made this run 43 times. The routine was mechanical. Load prisoners, enter warp, exit warp, offload prisoners, return for next shipment. The Imperium operates on repetition. I found comfort in that once. The warp translation occurred on schedule. 3rd day of Secundus, 847. M41, at 0400 hours ship time. I was in my quarters when the Geller field activated. You feel it as a pressure change, subtle, like your ears need to pop but won't. The lights flickered to emergency red as real space dissolved outside our protective bubble. I had experienced this 258 times before. The nausea passed within minutes. I returned to my desk and continued processing transfer documentation. The work never stopped. Day 4, nothing unusual. The prisoners remained secured in their blocks, 600 per section, stacked in restraint cradles that kept them immobile for transit. We fed them nutrient paste through automated delivery systems. Waste recycled through deck-level processing. My responsibility was inventory, food stores, medical supplies, ammunition for the armsmen, everything categorized and logged. The numbers had to balance. The administrator executed officers whose numbers failed to balance. Day 7. I noticed the first timing discrepancy. My chronometer read 0930 hours. The ship's main chrono displayed 11:45, a difference of 2 hours and 15 minutes. I reported this to the bridge. Commander Salis logged my report and instructed me to reset my chronometer to ship standard. I complied. The numbers had to match. Discrepancies suggested system failure, and system failure suggested deeper problems the Navy preferred to attribute to user error. Day 9, the ship shuddered. Not the normal vibration of the warp engines, but something deeper, structural. I was in the requisitions bay when it happened, surrounded by stacks of supply crates marked with the administratum's endless purity seals. The shudder knocked me against a shelf. 3 crates fell. I heard them crash, but felt the impact through my boots first, the deck plating resonating like a drum. The emergency klaxons activated for 40 seconds, then silenced. No announcement followed. I reset the fallen crates and logged them as potentially damaged contents. The work continued. Day 12, I met Tech Priest Quester in the main corridor outside the Engineerium. He was a withered man, more machine than flesh, with replacement eyes that glowed a dull amber. His mechadendrites moved with their own intelligence, adjusting panels on the wall as he walked. I asked about the shudder. He stopped, his biological eye, the one remaining focused on me. The machine spirit grows troubled, he said. The warp currents deviate from projected navigation channels. We adjust. His voice came from a vox grill in his throat, flat and precise. I asked if we were still on course. He regarded me for 3 full seconds before answering. Course is a theoretical construct in the Warp Requisitions Officer. We maintain the Emperor's heading. That is sufficient. He continued down the corridor, his robes dragging through a thin layer of condensation that perpetually covered the lower deck floors. Day 14. The prisoners began screaming, not in sections or groups, but all 80,000 simultaneously. The sound traveled through the deck, plating, through the walls, through the recycled air. I was in my quarters, filling out Form 7743, R/subsistence allocation when the screaming started. It lasted 4 hours. The armsmen reported no visible cause. The prisoners remained in their restraint cradles, eyes closed, but their throats worked continuously. The medical officer, a tired man named Sarvek, reported that sedation proved ineffective. The screaming stopped as suddenly as it began. The silence that followed felt worse, heavier, like the ship was holding its breath. Day 16, we should have reached the translation point for real space emergence. My chronometer indicated we were 2 days past expected arrival. The bridge transmitted a ship-wide announcement. Warp current anomalies required extended transit time. Estimated delay, 4 days. The captain's voice carried the kind of careful calm that suggested he was lying for morale purposes. I returned to my inventory. The numbers still had to balance. Day 23, I realized my chronometer had stopped. The hands no longer moved. I checked the ship's main chrono. It displayed a date that suggested we'd been in the warp for 19 days. I checked my personal logs. They indicated 23 days. I reported the discrepancy. Commander Celis instructed me to trust ship standard and discontinue personal time tracking. I complied, but I began counting days by meals. Breakfast marked time passage. The human mind requires measurement. Day 37, by my meal count, I encountered Navigator Secundus in the observation vestibule outside their sanctum. We were not supposed to see the navigators. They lived separate, sacred, necessary. But he stood there wrapped in his sensory deprivation hood, the cloth stained with what might have been tears or something worse. I stopped. He turned toward me, though his third eye remained covered. "We are lost," he said. Not to me specifically. To the air, to himself. "The Astronomicon. I cannot find the Astronomicon. There is only—" He stopped. He returned to the sanctum, the door sealed. I stood there for 60 seconds, processing what lost meant on a ship in the warp. Then I returned to my duties, because duties were all that remained. Day 49, the food inventory reached critical threshold. We had departed with sufficient provisions for a 16-day transit with 10 days safety margin. I ran the calculations 5 times. At current consumption rates, we had 40 days remaining. I reported this to Commander Celis. He instructed me to implement rationing protocol, reduce all rations by 15%, prisoner and crew alike. I complied. I entered the new allocation codes into the distribution system. The machine accepted my input without judgment. I logged the change and continued. Day 68, the first crewman died. Ensign Torval, assigned to deck monitoring in Section 23. They found him in a maintenance crawlway, curled around a pipe junction. No visible wounds. The medical officer determined cause of death as catastrophic neural hemorrhage, spontaneous, unexplained. We wrapped him in plastic sheeting and placed him in the ship's mortuary. Standard procedure. I updated the crew manifest, 2,319. Day 70, 3 more crew died. Different sections, same symptoms. The medical officer's report suggested warp exposure might be degrading the Gellerfield's effectiveness in certain areas. The captain ordered those sections sealed. We lost access to 4 storage bays and 2 crew quarters blocks. The ship felt smaller. Day 91. The prisoners began dying in significant numbers. The medical servitors in the containment blocks reported system alerts. Restraint cradles in Section 40 through 47 showed flatlined vitals. 8,000 dead. No apparent cause. The bodies remained in their cradles. We lacked the manpower to remove them and the storage to contain them. The captain ordered those sections sealed and temperature reduced to preserve the corpses. I updated the prisoner manifest, 70 to 1,000 units remaining. The math was simple. The horror was in the simplicity. Day 104, I met Armsman Sergeant Ivan Drost in the mess hall. We sat across from each other, eating our reduced rations in silence. The nutrient paste tasted of chemicals and despair, though I noted the despair might have been psychological projection. Drost was 40 years old, scarred, competent. He had served on 7 different vessels before unrepentant laborer. I had processed his transfer documentation myself 3 years prior. He looked at his tray and said, "This is how it ends. Not battle, not glory, starvation in a metal box." I had no response to offer. I finished my meal and logged my caloric intake as required. Day 119. The water recyclers failed in sections 12 through 18. Tech Priest Quester and his team worked for 36 continuous hours to restore function. They succeeded partially. Water rations reduced by 20% across all crew and prisoner blocks. I updated the consumption projections. The numbers formed a countdown. I could see the end point now, mathematical and certain. Day 147, Commander Celes called a senior staff meeting. 16 of us gathered in the bridge conference room. The captain, the commander, 3 section chiefs, 2 tech priests, the medical officer, the armsmen commander, and several logistics personnel, including myself. The captain stood at the head of the table, his face hollowed by weight loss and stress. He spoke clearly. "We have consumed 60% of our provisions. We have been in the warp for, by best estimation, 147 days. The navigators cannot locate the Astronomicon. We are lost in the Imperium with no projected emergence date." He paused. He looked at each of us in turn. "I am implementing emergency protocols. All non-essential systems will be shut down to conserve power. All personnel will be reduced to minimal sustenance rations. All prisoners will be reduced to survival threshold rations. He paused again. Longer this time, we will endure. The Emperor protects. We repeated the phrase because repetition was reflex. The Emperor protects. I noted that none of us sounded convinced. Day 163, I found Armsman Sergeant Drost in the armory, checking his weapons. The last locks gleamed under his care, cleaned with ritual precision. I asked what he was preparing for. He looked at me with eyes that had stopped registering surprise. The prisoners, he said, when the food runs out, when they break containment, we'll need every weapon ready. I noted this was logical tactical preparation. I helped him inventory the ammunition. We had 400,000 last charges. Mathematics suggested this was sufficient for multiple suppression scenarios. Mathematics did not account for desperation. Day 198, the captain ordered cessation of prisoner feeding in sections 60 through 80, 20,000 prisoners. He justified this as necessary resource conservation. The selected sections contained those with the longest sentences, those least likely to provide useful labor upon arrival. I processed the order into the distribution system. The machine accepted my input. I logged the change. I did not sleep that night. When I closed my eyes, I saw numbers. 20,000, declining daily, converting to days of extended survival for the remaining population. The math was simple. The horror was in the simplicity. Day 212, the prisoners in sections 60 through 80 had been without food for 14 days. The medical servitors reported vitals declining but stabilized. The human body can survive weeks without food if water remains available. The screaming from those sections continued for 11 days, then stopped. The silence was worse. I updated my projections. We had gained 18 days of operational sustainability. I logged this as a success in my reports, because that was how the administratum would classify it. Day 231, Tech Priest Questor died. I found him in passage 44. G collapsed against a bulkhead, with his mechadendrites still twitching. His biological components had failed, while his mechanical augments continued their programmed functions. The remaining tech priests retrieved his body and removed his sacred components for reinstallation in available servitors. They did not hold a service. They processed him as they processed all machine failures, with efficiency and no evident grief. I updated the crew manifest, 1874. Day 245, I met Medicae Sarvek in the medical bay. He sat at his desk, surrounded by reports he was no longer filing. His hands shook. He looked at me and said, "I've lost 400 patients to malnutrition. 400, and I ordered it." I stopped treating the prisoners to conserve medical supplies for crew. His voice cracked. I took an oath. I took a damned oath. I observed him for several seconds. I said, "You are following captain's orders. You are ensuring crew survival. This is logical resource allocation." He laughed. It sounded like breaking glass. "Yes," he said, "logical." He returned to his reports. I left him there, processing his complicity into whatever form allowed him to continue. Day 268, the food stores reached 20% capacity. I stood in the requisitions bay, running inventory counts that no longer required physical verification. I had memorized every crate, every seal, every contents listing. The numbers existed in my mind now, constant, updating with each meal distributed. I calculated days remaining, 42 at current consumption. I calculated population sustainability curves. I identified the point at which we would need to implement further reductions. The mathematics were clear. Someone would have to stop eating. Day 279. Commander Celis issued new orders. All crew reduced to 1 meal per day. All prisoners to 1 meal every other day. The armsmen would maintain full rations to preserve combat effectiveness for security requirements. I processed this into the system. I noted my own hunger as a biological data point, relevant but not critical. The body adjusts. The mind requires more time. Day 304. I met Armsman Sergeant Drost in the corridor outside my quarters. He walked with purpose, his laslock slung across his back. I asked where he was going. He said, Section 23. Disturbance reported. His voice was flat. I asked what kind of disturbance. He looked at me for 3 full seconds before answering. Prisoners broke a restraint cradle, trying to reach the maintenance passages. I asked how they broke free. The cradles were designed to restrain enhanced criminals. He said, Desperation is its own augmentation. He continued down the corridor. I returned to my quarters. I heard last fire 20 minutes later, distant echoing through the ventilation system. 6 shots, then silence. Day 319, I began to forget my father's face. I sat in my quarters, attempting to retrieve the memory, his features, his expression, the specific way he smiled. The data was corrupted. I could remember the moisture farm, the iron smell of soil, the dropships descending. But his face had become a blur, an approximation, a degraded file my mind could no longer fully access. I felt something that might have been grief, though I noted it more as biological response than emotional experience. The loss was logged. I continued. Day 346. The prisoners in sections 60 through 80 were fully dead. All 20,000. The medical servitors reported complete cessation of all biosigns. The sections had become a mortuary we could not process. The captain ordered them permanently sealed and vented to vacuum to prevent decomposition gas buildup. I updated the prisoner manifest. 52,000 units remaining. The math suggested we had gained 63 days of sustainability. I logged this and calculated the next necessary reduction. Day 378, I found Medicay Sarvek dead in his quarters. Stim overdose, self-administered. The syringe lay beside his bunk. He had left no note. The Imperium discourages suicide. It represents destruction of Imperial property. But no one reported it as such. Commander Sellers logged it as heart failure. We wrapped him in plastic sheeting and placed him in the mortuary. I updated the crew manifest, 1,719. I observed that the dead were beginning to outnumber categories on my data slate. Day 403. Armsman Sergeant Drost stopped me in the mess hall. He sat beside me, close enough that I could smell the unwashed scent of long weeks without adequate water for hygiene. He said, Vare, you're still keeping count, aren't you? I confirmed this. He nodded. What's the number? When do we run out? I provided the calculation. 67 days at current consumption and population. Less if more crew die. More if we implement additional reductions. He absorbed this. He said, there's another option. You know there is. I looked at him. I knew. The prisoners. 80,000 bodies minus the 28,000 dead. 52,000 remaining. Protein, calories, sustainability. The mathematics were clear. The horror was in the clarity. I said, that would require Captain's authorization. He said, Captain's already thinking it. We all are. The nutrient paste tasted of chemicals and the approaching moment when chemicals would no longer be enough. Day 419. The captain called another senior staff meeting. 8 of us this time. Attrition had reduced our leadership significantly. Captain Kalin stood at the head of the table. He had lost perhaps 20 kilograms. His uniform hung loose. His eyes sat deep in their sockets, shadowed. He did not waste time with preamble. We are going to survive, he said. We are Imperial Navy. We do not surrender to the void. We do not surrender to starvation. We will do what is necessary. He paused. He looked at each of us. I am authorizing Protocol Omega-7. Emergency sustenance measures. All deceased personnel will be processed through the protein reclamation system. All deceased prisoners will be processed through the protein reclamation system. The silence lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then Commander Sellers asked the question we all carried. And the living prisoners? Sir, we will begin with the deceased. We will reassess as circumstances require. I noted that reassess was the administratum's preferred term for expand the protocol to include murder. I did not speak this observation aloud. I logged the order into my data slate. The machine accepted my input without moral judgment. I envied it that capacity. Day 402,002, the protein reclamation began. The tech priests reconfigured the food processing machinery to accept organic material regardless of source. They blessed the machines with sacred oils and prayers to the Omnisire. They chanted the litany of necessary function. The machines did not care about theology. They ground what was fed into them and produced blocks of compressed protein, textured, edible, sufficient. We started with the mortuary. The crew who had died from malnutrition, neural hemorrhage, despair. 600 bodies. The tech priests logged them as reclaimed Imperial resources. I distributed the resulting protein blocks through the standard meal system. I did not inform the crew of the source. Commander Celis had ordered information containment for morale purposes. I ate my portion. It tasted of chemicals and something else, something that might have been psychological but felt physical, textural, real. I noted my body's acceptance of the nutrition. I noted my mind's resistance. The gap between body and mind widened. I logged this observation and continued my duties. Day 431, we processed the prisoners from sections 60 through 80. 20,000 bodies, frozen in vacuum, preserved. The armsmen retrieved them in shifts, loading them onto cargo lifters for transport to the processing machinery. I supervised the inventory. 20,000 units yielded approximately 400,000 kilograms of usable protein. I ran the calculations. At current consumption rates, this represented 218 days of sustainability for the remaining population. The mathematics were elegant. The horror was in the elegance. Armsman Sergeant Drost worked the retrieval detail. I found him in Processing Bay Delta, watching the bodies move along the conveyor system toward the grinders. His face showed nothing. I asked if the work troubled him. He looked at me. We're past troubled, Vare. We're into necessary. He gestured at the bodies. They were dead already. We're just efficient. I noted his use of administratum language. The system was teaching us how to justify. I logged this observation. Day 467, a prisoner in Section 34 managed to break his restraint cradle. We never determined how. The cradles were designed to restrain augmented criminals. But he freed himself and accessed the ventilation system. The armsmen tracked him for 6 hours before cornering him in a junction near the Imperium. Drost led the team. They returned him to containment. I saw the prisoner as they transported him past my station, emaciated, hollow-eyed, covered in ventilation grease, but alive in a way the rest of us were ceasing to be. He looked at me. He said, "You're eating us, aren't you? The ones who die, you're eating us." The armsmen struck him silent. They removed him. I returned to my inventory. He was not wrong. Day 493, the food stores, the original provisions, reached 0. The last crate contained 16 meal packets of standard nutrient paste. I distributed them according to protocol. Captain and senior staff. I did not receive one. I had crossed below the threshold of distribution priority. That evening, I received my first meal, composed entirely of reclaimed protein. The block was dense, dark, textured differently than standard nutrient paste. I ate it mechanically, processing it as fuel, as necessary function. I noted my body's acceptance. I noted my mind's increasing distance from my body. The gap widened. Day 512, we began selecting living prisoners for processing. Commander Celis issued the order in clinical language. Implement Sustainable Population Reduction Protocol. Identify non-viable units in prisoner population. Process according to Omega-7 procedures. Non-viable meant those too weak to provide useful labor upon arrival, if we ever arrived. The medical servitors scanned all prisoner blocks and flagged 8,000 individuals. The armsmen went section by section, cradle by cradle. They administered lethal injections. The prisoners did not resist. They lacked the strength. The bodies went to processing. I logged the inventory increase. I updated the prisoner manifest. 44,000 units remaining. The mathematics extended our sustainability by 96 days. I noted I had stopped thinking of them as people. The system had taught me new categories. They were units. They were resources. They were fuel. Day 541. I met Armsman Sergeant Drost in the armory. He sat cleaning his last lock with movements that had become ritual, repetitive, meditative. I asked if he was well. He looked at me. Do you remember what you looked like, Barre, before? I did not answer, because I did not remember. The mirror in my quarters had broken, or I had removed it. I could not recall which. I had not seen my reflection in perhaps 200 days. He continued. I saw myself in a polished surface yesterday. Deck plating shined up from someone's spilled water. I didn't recognize the face looking back. He set down his weapon. We're becoming something else. You feel it? I felt it. The distance between who I had been and what I was becoming stretched across subjective years. I said, we are adapting to circumstances. Psychological flexibility represents survival capacity. He laughed. It sounded like tearing metal. That what we're calling it? Adaptation? He picked up his weapon again. I killed 63 prisoners last week, Vare. Walked the sections, checked the medical servitor lists, administered the injections. 63. I knew their unit numbers. I logged them properly. Then I ate my meal and slept 8 hours. He looked at me. Before, that would have destroyed me. Now it's just work. I had no response. I left him there, processing his transformation into language that might allow him to continue. Day 579. The water recyclers failed completely in sections 45 through 52. The tech priests could not restore function. Components had degraded beyond ritual repair. We lost 20% of our water reclamation capacity. Commander Celis implemented severe rationing, 1 liter per person per day, crew and prisoners. I calculated sustainability. Water would become critical before food. The body requires water more urgently than calories. I projected 14 days before severe dehydration effects, 21 days before death. The mathematics were unforgiving. Day 586. The navigator Primus emerged from the sanctum. This was unprecedented. The navigators never left their chamber, but he came to the bridge, wrapped in his hood, his third eye binding leaking fluids that stained the cloth dark. Captain Kalin demanded status. The navigator's voice emerged rough, broken. There is no Astronomicon. There is no light. There is only the warp, infinite, endless. We swim in an ocean without shore. The captain asked for estimated emergence time. The navigator laughed. It sounded like madness being given voice. Time is the infection. We have been lost for centuries. We have been lost for seconds. The warp does not measure. It consumes. He returned to the sanctum. The door sealed. I logged his statement as evidence of psychological degradation. I noted that psychological degradation suggested he was wrong. I noted that I wanted him to be wrong more than I believed he was wrong. Day 603. I encountered Junior Requisitions Officer Harren Cade in the storage bays. He was 24 years old, assigned to unrepentant laborer only 60 days before we entered the warp. He had been efficient, quiet, competent. Now he stood among the empty crates, weeping, not quietly, full racking sobs that echoed in the empty space. I approached. I asked the nature of the distress. He looked at me with eyes that still remembered how to feel. We're monsters, he said. We're eating people, and we're just doing it. Like it's normal. Like it's procedure. I observed him for several seconds. I said, it is procedure. The captain authorized Omega-7. We are following orders, we are ensuring survival. Is this what we're surviving as? I had no answer. I left him there. I heard later that he attempted to access the maintenance airlocks, presumably to end his existence through vacuum exposure. The armsman stopped him. Commander Sellers ordered him sedated and placed in restraint for psychological stabilization. I never saw him again. I updated the crew manifest later, 1496. The system did not record whether he died or simply disappeared into some sealed section where the unstable were contained. The distinction ceased to matter. Day 637, the prisoners began to organize. The armsmen reported coordinated cradle-breaking attempts in sections 12, 18, and 23. Somehow they had learned the pattern. They waited until the armsman patrol passed, then worked the restraint releases simultaneously. 18 prisoners freed themselves. They moved as a group toward the maintenance passages. The armsmen responded with lethal force. Last fire echoed through the decks for 20 minutes. 17 prisoners killed. One escaped into the ventilation system. Drost led the hunt. They found him 3 days later, dead from dehydration in a sealed crawlway. The body went to processing. I logged the reclaimed resources and updated the prisoner manifest. 43,980, 2 units remaining. Day 659, Captain Kalin called a ship-wide assembly in the main cargo hold. This was unprecedented. We had not gathered the full crew in over 400 days. 1,400 personnel assembled. We stood in formation, silent, waiting. The captain ascended to the observation platform. He looked diminished, fragile, ancient. He spoke through the Vox system, his voice echoing, "We have endured 659 days in the warp. We have lost crew. We have lost prisoners. We have implemented protocols that test the boundaries of our humanity. But we have not surrendered. We are Imperial Navy. We do not fail. We do not break. The Emperor watches us. He sees our sacrifice. He will guide us home." No one responded. The silence stretched. Then, from the back of the formation, someone laughed. Not hysteria, genuine amusement. The sound spread. Within seconds, half the assembly was laughing, a sound that echoed wrong in the cargo hold that sounded like breaking rather than joy. The captain demanded silence. The laughter continued. He ordered armsman intervention. The laughter stopped not from fear, but from exhaustion. We dispersed. I returned to my duties. I noted that faith functions as operational protocol until it doesn't. Day 704, the tech priests reported critical engine degradation. The warp engines had operated continuously for over 700 days, far beyond their designed sustainable operation duration. Components were failing. The machine spirits, despite endless ritual and prayer, were weakening. I asked what failure meant. The senior tech priest, a woman named Korvax who was 70% augmentation, stated, "If the engines fail completely while in the warp, the Geller field collapses. The ship becomes fully exposed to the Imperium. All aboard experience immediate consumption or worse." I asked what was worse than consumption. She looked at me with optical implants that could not express emotion but somehow suggested pity. Transformation, the warp does not only destroy, sometimes it alters, sometimes it improves. The way she said improves suggested the word meant something different to the warp than it did to us. Day 731. I met Armsman Sergeant Ivan Drost in the mess hall. We sat across from each other as we had hundreds of times. The reclaimed protein blocks sat on our trays. We ate in silence. Halfway through the meal, he stopped. He set down his utensil. He said, "Vare, I need to tell you something." I looked at him. He continued, "I volunteered for the selection duty. When Commander Celis asked for armsmen to handle the prisoner reductions, I volunteered. Every time. I've personally processed 416 prisoners." He paused. "I do it because someone has to. Because if I don't, someone else will. And maybe they'll do it worse. Maybe they'll make it hurt. I make it quick. I verify the lethal injection works before I move to the next cradle. I give them that much." His voice cracked. That's my humanity now, making sure the murder is efficient. I observed him. I said, "You are performing necessary function. You are following orders. This ensures our survival." He said, "I know. That's what makes it worse. It is necessary, and I'll keep doing it. And every time I do, a piece of whatever I was dies. But I keep waking up, keep functioning." He looked at me. "You're the only person I can tell this to. Everyone else has stopped talking about it. We just do it, like it's normal. You still process it. I can see it in your face. You still think about what we're doing." I noted he was correct. I still processed. I still observed the horror even as I participated in it. I said, "I log the data. I track the numbers. That is my function." "That's different." He resumed eating. We finished the meal in silence. I noted the distinction he had made. Witness, not participant, not victim. Witness. The word carried weight. Day 768. The prisoners in Section 9 broke containment en masse. 200 cradles simultaneously released. They had discovered some override mechanism the tech priests insisted was impossible. 200 emaciated, desperate prisoners flooded into the corridor. The armsmen responded. I heard the lust fire from 3 decks away, continuous, sustained. It lasted 47 minutes. When it stopped, Commander Celeste reported 196 prisoners dead. 4 had reached the ventilation system. Drost led teams to hunt them. I went to Section 9 to log the incident for my reports. The corridor was covered in carbon scoring and blood. The bodies lay stacked where they had fallen, trying to push forward through last fire that cut them down in waves. I saw their faces. Young, old, male, all carrying the same expression. Desperate relief. They had chosen death by last fire over slow starvation in the cradles. I understood this was logical. I logged the incident. I noted the bodies were already being collected for processing. Nothing was wasted. The system was perfectly efficient. Day 812, I found one of the escaped prisoners. I was conducting inventory in Storage Bay 18 when I heard breathing behind a crate stack. I should have called the armsman. Instead, I approached. He huddled there, skeletal, covered in filth, barely conscious. He looked at me with eyes that had gone beyond fear into some place of pure animal survival. I asked his unit number. He did not respond. I asked his name. He whispered, "Merrick. My name is Merrick. I had a family. Mortwald. I told a joke. Just a joke. 20 years they gave me. 20 years." His voice broke. "How long has it been? How long have we been here?" I calculated. I said, 812 days subjective. 2 years, 1 month, 17 days. He absorbed this. He said, "It feels like forever. It feels like we've always been here." He looked at me. "Are you going to kill me?" I observed him. I calculated his caloric value. I calculated his threat potential. I calculated my options. I said, "If I report you, the armsmen will execute you and send your body to processing. Your protein value is approximately 60 kilograms. This extends sustainability by 0.03 days. He waited. I said, "If I do not report you, you will die here from dehydration within 3 days. Your body will be discovered during the next inventory cycle and sent to processing. Same result, delayed." He said, "Then why does it matter what you choose?" I had no answer. I stood there, observing him, processing the question. Why did it matter? The mathematics were identical. The outcome was fixed. But something in me, some fragment of the person who had stood on Cyprus Secundus and smelled rain on iron soil, recognized that it mattered. The choice mattered not for him but for me, for what remained of me. I said, "There is a maintenance passage in Section 23 that accesses the water recycling system. The seals are weak. If you reach it, you can access water. It will prolong your survival." He stared at me. "Why?" I said, "I do not know." This was true. I left him there. I did not report the encounter. I logged the storage bay as cleared. 3 days later, the armsmen found him in Section 23, dead from malnutrition, collapsed near the water recyclers. The body went to processing. I logged the reclaimed resources. I noted that my choice had changed nothing except myself. The gap between what I was and what I had been narrowed fractionally, then widened again. The system was patient. Day 873, Armsman Sergeant Ivan Drost stopped me in the corridor outside my quarters. He looked different. Thinner, yes, we were all skeletal now, but something else. His eyes carried a distance. He said, "Varry, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to just listen." I listened. He continued, "I can't do the selections anymore. I went to Section 40 today to process the medical servitors list. 17 units flagged as non-viable. I walked to the first cradle. Unit 34,556. Male, 47 years old, sentenced from Cipra Secundus for..." He stopped. He looked at me. "Cipra. Your home world." I looked at his intake file. He knew your father. Worked a neighboring moisture farm. He might have known you. I felt something shift in my chest, a physical sensation, like internal structures rearranging. I said, "Did you process him?" I couldn't do it. I logged him as processed and moved on. He's still alive in that cradle. He paused. "I'm done, Varre. I can't be the one who does this anymore. I'm transferring to maintenance detail. Someone else can do the selections." I said, "Who?" He said, "I don't know. I don't care. Not me. Not anymore." He continued down the corridor. I stood there, processing the information. Unit 34,556. Cipra Secundus, my father's neighbor. A man who might have watched me board the dropships at 14. A man who had committed some administrative crime and received 20 years. A man who had survived 873 days in a restraint cradle, only to be flagged for processing. I went to Section 40. I accessed Unit 34,556's cradle. He lay there, emaciated, barely conscious, kept alive by minimal nutrient delivery and automated medical systems. His face held no features I recognized. 2 years of confinement had erased individuality. I checked the intake file. Name, Darren Voss. Age, 60-1. Crime, unlicensed moisture collection exceeding household allocation. Sentence, 20 years labor. Origin, Cyprus Secundus, Eastern Plateaus. The Eastern Plateaus. Where my father's farm had stood, this man had breathed the same air I remembered. Had seen the same horizon, had perhaps spoken to my father about weather, crops, the tithe, the mundane concerns of a life that felt like fiction now. I observed him. I calculated his caloric value. I calculated his probability of useful labor if we ever reached Gorast 9th. The numbers indicated non-viability. The system's logic was flawless. I stood there for 37 minutes. Then I logged him as processed and left. I did not administer the injection. I did not report Drost's failure to process him. I simply logged false data and continued my duties. The lie sat in the system like a small tumor. I noted my complicity had expanded. I was no longer just participating in the horror. I was subverting it in ways that changed nothing but myself. The system allowed for this, I realized. The system was large enough to contain small rebellions that ultimately meant nothing. Day 904, Unit 34,556, was processed by a different armsman during a section-wide sweep. His body went to the reclamation system. I logged the resources. I noted that my small rebellion had extended his survival by 31 days. I noted that 31 days in a restraint cradle might constitute torture rather than mercy. I noted that I would never know if my choice had been compassion or cruelty. The system did not measure such distinctions. Day 947, Commander Celis called me to his office. This was unusual. I arrived to find him sitting behind his desk, surrounded by reports he was no longer filing. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. "Very. You're still keeping accurate counts. I need the real numbers, not the reports I send to the captain, not the sanitized versions. The truth." I provided the data. 1,163 crew remaining. 28,400 prisoners remaining. Water recycling at 42% capacity. Protein stores sufficient for 118 days at current consumption. Engine degradation approaching critical thresholds. Time in warp, 947 days subjective. He absorbed this. He said, "Almost 1,000 days, 3 years gone, and we're no closer to emergence than we were on day 1. He looked at me. "Do you still believe we'll get out, Vare?" I said, "Belief is not relevant to my function. I log data, I track resources, I calculate sustainability." He said, "That's not what I asked." I observed him. I processed the question honestly. I said, "No, Commander. I do not believe we will emerge. I believe we will continue until resources are exhausted. Then the ship will fail, and we will experience whatever the warp does to those it consumes. But belief does not alter my duties. I will continue to function until I cannot." He nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty." He dismissed me. I returned to my quarters. I noted that speaking the truth had felt like betrayal, though I could not identify what I had betrayed. Hope, perhaps, the communal fiction that we were enduring rather than dying slowly. Day 1036, the ship shuddered again. Massive, structural, the kind of vibration that suggested something fundamental was breaking. The emergency klaxons activated and did not silence. I was thrown against the wall of my quarters, my data slate shattered. 3 years of logs destroyed. I felt something that might have been grief at the loss, though I noted the logs existed in the main system as backup. The loss was symbolic rather than actual. The grief was real regardless. The shuddering continued for 6 hours, then stopped. Captain Kalin announced via ship-wide Vox, "All hands, this is the captain. The warp engines have experienced catastrophic failure. The tech priests are implementing emergency repairs. The Geller field remains stable. We remain protected. Continue your duties. The Emperor protects." The Emperor, if he watched at all, was observing our suffering with the same clinical distance I had learned to employ. We were data to him. Numbers in an endless calculation. I found comfort in this idea. If even the God Emperor processed humanity as statistics, then my own detachment represented theological alignment. Day 1097, the repairs failed. Tech Priest Korvax reported to the senior staff. The engines could not be restored to full function. We had sufficient power to maintain the Geller field and basic life support, but not enough to force emergence from the warp. We were trapped. Caught in the Imperium with no capacity to return to real space, the captain asked for solutions. Korvax stated, "We pray, we perform the rituals. We hope the machine spirits accept our devotions and grant us mercy." The captain asked for technical solutions. Korvax repeated, "We pray." Day 1143, I sat in my quarters attempting to remember my name. Malcolm Vare, Requisitions Officer Tertius Grade, Imperial Navy, assigned to unrepentant laborer. The words felt foreign. I knew they described me, but the connection between the description and my sense of self had degraded. I was becoming function without identity. The system's final lesson: you are what you do. And what I did was count resources, log deaths, and participate in efficient horror. Day 2008, Armsman Sergeant Ivan Drost found me in the mess hall. He sat across from me. We did not speak. We had stopped speaking weeks earlier. All conversation had ceased to mean anything. But he sat there, and I sat there, and the proximity felt like communication. He was the closest thing I had to connection now. Everyone else had become units, functions, resources. But Drost remained somehow distinct, perhaps because he had also witnessed Perhaps because he carried the same burden of processing horror while participating in it. We sat for 30 minutes. Then he stood and left. I noted this was likely the last time I would classify an interaction as meaningful. The capacity was degrading. I was learning to exist without connection, without meaning, without the anchors that had once defined human experience. Day 2074. I found Armsman Sergeant Ivan Drost in his quarters. He had used his last lock, single shot through the roof of his mouth. The wall behind him carried the physical evidence of his decision. His eyes remained open, looking at something I could not see. I stood there for several minutes, observing, processing, attempting to feel something proportional to the loss. He had been the last person I spoke to as a person rather than a function, the last individual who had seemed to maintain some fragment of who they had been before. Now he was gone, and I stood there, noting that my primary emotional response was the recognition that his protein value was approximately 70 kilograms, and that this would extend sustainability by 0.04 days. I reported the death to Commander Sellés. I logged the body for processing. I returned to my quarters. I sat on my bunk. I attempted to cry. The biological response did not activate. I had degraded past the threshold where grief produced tears. I sat there, dry-eyed, processing the loss through the only framework remaining, mathematical, clinical, efficient. Drost was gone. The system had taken him slowly over 2,274 days, converting him from soldier to murderer to function to corpse. And I had witnessed it, and I had logged it, and I would continue, because continuing was all that remained. I noted that he had been right. Back on day 731, I was bearing witness, not participating, not surviving witnessing, recording the machinery of imperial horror as it ground through human consciousness and produced something else. Something that could log its friend's death as a resource gain and feel nothing but the distant memory that once this would have destroyed me. Day 1319, the prisoner population reached critical minimum. 8,000 units remained. Commander Sellés calculated that further reductions would not significantly extend sustainability. 8,000 prisoners in restraint cradles consumed minimal resources. The decision was made, no further processing. The remaining prisoners would be maintained until ship resources failed entirely. I logged this decision and noted its irony. We had consumed 72,000 prisoners to sustain ourselves, but these final 8,000 would die with us when the ship finally failed. They had survived the selections only to reach the same endpoint. Day 1461, I stopped logging daily entries. Time had ceased to function as discrete units. Days blurred into continuous present. I existed. I performed duties. I logged data. But the passage of time became irrelevant. I was in the eternal moment of systemic horror, stretched across subjective years. The ship continued, the crew diminished. 700 personnel remaining at my last count. The prisoners in their cradles, maintained by automated systems. The engines barely functional. The Geller field holding. We floated in the warp. Lost, sustained by the ground remnants of those we had consumed. I sat in my quarters one day, or night, the distinction had ceased, and attempted to calculate total time elapsed. My chronometer had long since stopped functioning. Ship time had become meaningless. I estimated based on meal counts, sleep cycles, reports filed. My best calculation, 14,600 days. 40 years. Subjective 40 years in the warp. 40 years. I was 63 years old. I had boarded this ship at 23. I had spent 40 years in a metal coffin, floating in hell, watching humanity be processed into fuel. I looked at my hands. They were skeletal, aged, unrecognizable. I had not seen my face in perhaps 20 years. I did not know what I looked like. I did not know if I would recognize myself. I suspected I would not. Then, on a day that felt like all others, the ship shuddered differently, not breaking, transitioning. The emergency klaxons activated with a pattern I had not heard in 40 years. Emergence protocol. The Vox crackled. Captain Caline's voice, ancient and broken. All hands. We are emerging from the warp. Prepare for real space translation. Emergence. After 40 years, I felt nothing. No relief, no joy, no hope. Just the continuation of function. The ship would emerge. And then what? The translation occurred. The pressure changed. The light shifted from emergency red to standard white. The vibration of the warp engines ceased. Silence. Real silence. The kind that exists in real space, not the heavy, pressing silence of the warp. I remained in my quarters for 6 hours. Then I went to my duty station. Commander Celes was already there, looking at sensor readouts. He looked at me. We had not spoken directly in perhaps 5 years. He said, "We're here. Gorast Irons, the destination. We arrived." I processed this. 40 years late, but arrived. I said, "The prisoners?" He said, 612 remain alive, out of 80,000. I calculated the mortality rate, 90 to 9.23%. I noted this was higher than standard penal transport mortality rates by approximately 90 to 8%. I noted that this was the kind of statistical anomaly that would require extensive reporting to the administratum. The Vox crackled. A new voice, external, unrepentant laborer. This is Gorast 9's orbital control. You are cleared for dock at Penal Reception Station 12. Prepare for boarding inspection. Commander Celes activated the Vox. Orbital control, this is unrepentant laborer. Be advised extensive casualties during transit. Request immediate medical and administrative support. Boarding teams deploying now. I went to Processing Bay Alpha to meet the boarding team. They arrived in full environment suits, armed, cautious. The team leader approached me. He looked at me through his helmet visor. I saw his expression shift from professional to horrified. He said, "Emperor's mercy, what happened to you?" I said, 40 years in the warp, resource conservation protocols, necessary survival measures. He said, 40 years. Your manifest says 16 days transit time. I said, the warp does not measure time consistently. Subjective transit, 40 years. He turned away. He vomited inside his helmet. I noted this was an inefficient response to information. His team spread through the ship. I heard their Vox chatter, words like nightmare and abomination, and how are they still alive? The team leader returned. He said, We're going to need to quarantine this vessel. Full investigation. You and your crew will be transferred to orbital facilities for medical examination and debriefing. I said, and the prisoners? He looked at me. He said, what prisoners? I said, 612 units remain in the containment sections. He conferred with his team via Vox. A long pause. Then he said, show me. I led him to section 12. We entered. The prisoners lay in their cradles, alive but barely. 40 years in restraint. Some had not moved in decades. Their muscles had atrophied. Their minds had degraded. They looked at us with eyes that held nothing. No fear, no hope, no recognition. The team leader walked the rows, looking at each cradle. He stopped. He turned to me. He said, These aren't viable. They can't be rehabilitated. They can't even stand. I said, they have survived. Processing intact prisoners is standard procedure upon arrival. He said, processing? You mean sending them to the labor camps? I said, correct. He looked at the prisoners. He looked at me. He said, they can't work. They can barely breathe. He activated his Vox. Orbital control, this is boarding team 7. The prisoners are non-viable, all of them. Request guidance. A long pause. Then the response, administer the Emperor's mercy. Cleanse the vessel. The team leader looked at me. He said, you understand what that means? I understood. The Emperor's mercy. Execution. All 612 prisoners. All 700 crew. All of us. We had survived 40 years in hell. had consumed 79,400 of our own to sustain ourselves, had degraded from human to function to something less, and we had arrived. And arrival meant death. The team leader said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Do not apologize. This is procedure. The Imperium requires clean accounting. We represent statistical and biological anomaly. Cleansing is logical." He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Perhaps I was. I had learned the language of the system so thoroughly that human concepts like mercy and tragedy no longer translated properly. They processed us over 3 days. Lethal injection administered efficiently. The crew went first. I watched them line up, accept the injection, collapse. No one resisted. We had learned acceptance over 40 years. Resistance was inefficient. The prisoners went next. 612 souls who had survived the unsurvivable, only to be executed upon arrival. I logged their deaths. Old habits persist even in terminal moments. I was among the last. They led me to the administration deck, to a chair, to the armsman with the syringe. He asked if I had any final words. I processed the question. Final words. Testament. Witness. I said, "Log this. Requisitions Officer Tertius Grade Malcolm Vare, Imperial Navy assigned to Penal transport vessel unrepentant laborer. Transit time, 40 years subjective. Mortality rate, 90 to 9.98%. Survival protocols included systematic cannibalism of prisoner and crew populations. This officer participated in and facilitated all necessary protocols. Upon arrival at destination, all surviving personnel executed according to standard cleansing procedures. Total mission outcome, complete loss. Total resource expenditure, 82,400 human lives converted to fuel for systemic continuation that ultimately failed. This is what the Imperium costs. This is what the Imperium is. A machine that consumes everything fed into it and produces only more hunger. I participated. I witnessed. I logged the data. I am the data. Log this. Let it be recorded. Let someone know what we became. The armsman looked at me. He said, "I'll log it." I said, "You won't." But I had to speak it anyway. He administered the injection. I felt the chemical cold spread through my veins. My vision narrowed. The last thing I processed was the recognition that I had spent 40 years becoming the perfect Imperial functionary. Efficient, compliant, willing to process horror into procedure. And the system had rewarded me with exactly what it promised. Continuation until I was no longer useful, then clean disposal. The Emperor protects, they said. They were wrong. The Emperor consumes. And we feed ourselves to him, one horror at a time, believing the consumption means something. Believing the suffering has purpose. It doesn't. There is only the machine. And the machine is always hungry. I archived this final observation and ceased function.